I'm Leon Todd for G66. Welcome to another Tuesday Tone Tip. On today's video, I want to share some of my favorite tips and tricks for dialing in a reverb on the Axe FX3, FM3 and FM9. I've started off with the Class A 30-watt top boost model, a factory York audio cabinet based around a Vox AC15, and just the stock medium room reverb. I haven't touched this at all. I'll let you hear the tone with the reverb off on my PRS Custom 24. Then I will kick the reverb in, just as a starting point. So it's pretty subtle in there, and an effect like this, to me, is less of an effect and more of like something that just places your guitar in space. It's not like a big ambient reverb, which we will of course get to. You start playing with this sort of sound and you forget that there's even reverb on the guitar. You only really notice it when you turn it off. It's almost like with it off, the guitar is too in your face and too dry. So that's definitely going to cover a lot of people there, these medium and small reverb types where you have the time below 1 second, a reverb size probably below 40 or 50, and the mix hovering somewhere around 20%. I think if you just want a tiny amount of ambience, it's a really good way to do it. You can use any of the different reverb types, plug those numbers in, and it's going to work pretty well, which leads me to the first real point in here, and that is exploring the different reverb types. I think that taste plays such an important element in here that there is no way for me to diagnose what particular type of reverb somebody's going to like unless they've got experience with the reverb. So my first tip would be to do this. Open up the reverb types in here, and what you could do is you could filter all of these by, say, the size. Let's type in small over here. I'm going to hit return on there, and then I'm going to hit the little pin up here. So this is going to let me choose between all the small reverb types. For example, I could start with small Cathedral and then just cycle through chamber, hall, plate, room, and spring, and just get a rough idea of the different character of each of these reverbs while I'm playing with the particular sound that I have, and I'll let my ears decide what I like. Now you could repeat this for medium types and large types as well, but I'm just using that as an example of filtering out all the options and doing a comparison. You could hear in there that the Cathedral and chamber definitely have this big effecty sound about them. It sounds like you're doing something to your guitar in there and that the reverb is a pronounced effect, whereas something like the room or even the hall and the plate, they just kind of sit around your main guitar tone and enhance it rather than overpower it. And then you've got the spring, which sounds like a spring reverb, and that just has loads and loads of character. I find people either love spring reverb or they have no time for it. So for me, I could hear in there that the plate was definitely the darker sounding reverb in there, which I tend to like. So let's start by filtering out all the plates in there, and then I can audition all the different plate reverbs. You know, this is just my personal taste. If you like the hall or the Cathedral, filter those out. And again, we've got the pin in here. So I'm going to start down the bottom with vocal plate and just kind of move up through the different types, just to be different. And for me, I end up where I always end up, which is on the London plate reverb in here. It just works for me. This is what I like to hear in a sort of small to medium size reverb on there. I like it on clean sounds. I like it on dirty sounds. I'm very used to the sound. But if I was going to choose another, maybe for a slightly more lush reverb, I might go with the Sun plate or the vocal plate. So let's go with the vocal plate for something different, because you all hear London plate reverb in my videos all the time. Once I've got this, I can really fine tune it by playing around with the time, the size, and the mix control on here. You know, if I really wanted this to be in effect, I would turn the mix control up around 50%, or maybe even beyond 50%. I can, of course, play around with the time control here. If I want a massive ambient reverb, go up around 20 seconds. There are several cloud-type reverbs in here which have these as presets, but I just really want to focus on these kind of core flavors in here. Let's hear this with the time around 20 seconds. I'm going to bring the mix up above 50% and just compensate by turning the level up to around 3 dB. I'm going to do some swells here as well, because this is going to create some epic pads. Or I could do the opposite and keep the mix really low and the time around 1 second. Which is nice and subtle in there. Let's do this. Let's turn the time back up to 3 seconds and the mix up to around 20%. Personally, I think if I was going to go for those super long reverbs in there, I would choose a hall-based reverb, or I would choose one of these cloud types like the cumulonimbus or the stratocumulus. I might do a separate video about those types. Let me know if you'd like to hear that and see that in a future Tuesday Tone Tip. Just leave a comment below. So where am I? Vocal plate, 3 seconds, size, and mix. What I want to do here is just show you the power of EQ on reverb. And again, a lot of these things are pretty subtle. I think once you get the reverb type that you like and the decay and mix sorted, you're pretty much there. But it's fun to be able to have these extra options in here. And a big one that I like, a lot of people call this the Abbey Road trick, is to apply a low cut to the reverb only. So you're going to remove any excess buildup of low end in the reverb. Really easy to do in the Axe-Fx. Just go over to the EQ section and let's set the low cut slope to 12 dB and bring the low cut up anywhere above 200 Hertz. I'm going to start with it at around 400 Hertz just to make it a little bit more extreme. Actually, I'll let you hear it at 20 and then I'll do 400 so that when I hit enter, you'll hear the reverb with the low end filtered out. That's particularly useful if you're going to be using reverb with higher gain tones with a lot of low end in there. You're going to end up with a lot of low end energy in your reverb otherwise, which can kind of wash things out and make it sound muddy. So that little low cut trick is really, really handy. The other advanced, I would say, trick in here is actually going to the advanced tab, surprise, surprise, and playing around with the early level versus the late level. Essentially, the early level is going to be like if you walk into a room and, you know, clap, and those initial reflections that you hear, that's the early level. It's going to be determined by like the shape of the virtual room in here. And then the late level is going to refer to those reverb tails and the character of the decay. So if you really want to deep dive with these, I'm going to do this. I'm actually going to bring up a second reverb block over here on the Axe-Fx 3. So I'll just replace this with reverb 2 for now. What I've done is I've got the large room reverb type, time is at 3 seconds, size is at 50, mix is at 35, and I've got the large hall. Same settings there. What we're going to do is have a listen to these with the early level at 0 dB and the late level at -40, and just hear how the early level is determined by the shape of the room. You're going to get a very different sound. This isn't necessarily pleasant, but I think it can be very informative if you want to learn more about reverb. Go through your favorite reverb, set the time, the size, and the mix the same, and then set the early level to 0 and the late level to -40 in them, and you can compare, I guess, this early level tone in there. Let's check it out. To me, that's pretty interesting. While the differences are subtle, they're there, and they're pretty pronounced between, say, the large room and the large plate, and then the large hall and the large cathedral. The hall almost has this kind of like asymmetric quality about it, where the plate is very symmetric. You can then repeat the same experiment with the same settings, but turn the early level all the way down and the late level to 0 dB. This is going to give you what I would refer to as the lush part of the reverb. You can almost think of the reverb as being like the early level determines like how percussive and weighty your reverb is, and then the late level determines sort of like how lush and pretty it is. Let's do the same thing. So you could hear there that the plate and the cathedral have darker tails in there with less pronounced high end, whereas the hall has a lot of shimmery high end, and the room in that case on the later part of the reflections, kind of similar to the hall in there. So what I could do is I could go to the large hall if I like the way this sounds for this kind of clean sound, and I could go into the advanced section. What I'm going to do is just play a chord and slowly turn the early level up until I get sort of like the weight and body that I want out of my reverb. That's assuming I like where the late level and the decay is. So again, we go back to an earlier step where you adjust the time, the size, and the mix in there. Notice that I haven't talked about pre-delay just yet. I'll mention that in just a second, but I'll do this. We'll go from the early level at -40 to -20 and then to 0. Some extreme steps. The ideal tone is going to be somewhere in there. At the moment, I'm kind of liking that around -15. As with this entire video, use your ears and tailor this to your taste. I did talk about pre-delay before. Pre-delay is going to be the amount of time before your initial signal and then the actual reverb kicking in. So if I was going for a small reverb, keep the pre-delay quite low. But if I was using something like, say, one of the cloud types, let's go with cumulonimbus, you can see the pre-delay by default is quite high on there. That's going to give your raw guitar sound and the big affected reverb a little bit of space between it. If I turn this down to 0 and play something, it's almost like the reverb's too on top of your tone or something. With a little bit of pre-delay though, it's just putting that space between the core guitar sound and the big washy reverb. Reverb is something that I find both incredibly inspiring and very utilitarian and useful when it comes to guitar sounds, and I would highly recommend you use this method when you go exploring the reverb if you're inexperienced with it. Start by selecting the type and size a lot of the time you can just stop there and get a great sounding reverb and make music with it. If you do want to dive a little bit deeper, you have these time, size, and mix controls to tweak. You've got the EQ in the reverb, and you've got the pre-delay and that early late balance in there to really cater the reverb to your particular taste. To my ears, having that early level a little bit higher with the late level blended in gives me the sound of like early digital reverb units and mechanical reverbs in there that have some of that extra, I don't know, like weight or girth to them, but maybe don't have the big lush tails on them. Whereas a lot of, say, modern reverb pedals that aim to give you that big epic pad sound don't have much of the early level going on. They're like all reverb tail in there. You've also got things on the Axe FX3 and FM9 like pitch shifting, and then you've got modulation and ducking in the reverb as well. So it is an incredibly dense block, an incredibly inspiring block, or something that you can just bring up, drop a type in, and go and play with. Let me know what your favorite reverb types and tricks are in the comment section below. Thanks so much for watching the video, and if you would like me to do a similar thing with other blocks, let me know. I'm always happy to cater to requests on here. Hope you enjoyed the video. I will see you all next week for another Tuesday Tone Tip.